Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar, which is focusing on return to work interviews. Just want to make sure you can all see my screen. So let's get that started first. There we go. And before we make a start, we would like to just introduce ourselves. So I'm Victoria Templeton, one of the HR Knowledge Managers here at HR Solutions, and I'll be leading today's webinar. And with me today is Sue Watson, Head of Client Services, and together we're going to take you through a Q&A at the end, and obviously have some discussions on our live interactive polls that we're going to run as well. We're also joined by our colleague Drew, who's our Digital Marketing Executive, so he's going to be here to support us more from a technical perspective. So hopefully there won't be any technical issues, but should there be, and you are able to let us know, then just do comment, send us a question, and we'll try and get something sorted and try and help you. And because we've got lots of you who've joined us today, you are all on mute, but as I mentioned a moment ago, we do want to hear your questions at the end so that Sue and I can take those. So when you see this slide, that means we're at the end of the webinar and ready to take your live questions. So please do raise them as we go throughout the webinar. So I'm just going to give you a quick run through of how you can submit your questions. So on the screen now, you'll see an image of what your GoToWebinar panel screen looks like. So simply type in your question in the question pane, and as I said, we'll aim to read as many out as we can at the end. And when you see this slide, it means that we're going to be running a confidential poll just to seek your input, because that helps with the running of our webinar and provides some useful conversation and discussion points. So we'll be doing that throughout our webinar as well. But if you do want to participate, just note that you need to be out of the full screen mode because for some reason GoToWebinar doesn't allow you to participate in polls when you're in the full screen. So let's begin on return to works and why we do them. So this is what I thought we'd run through today. So we're going to start looking at some key information about sickness absence in general, because this will set the context for the return to work discussions and information that I'll run through. We're going to look at how you calculate sickness absence in your business, and then after that we're going to then focus on the main part of the webinar, which is about looking at the return to work interview and really explore why they are so important for every business. And as usual, we'll end with questions at the end. So we know from various pieces of evidence that sickness absence costs the business and the UK economy a lot each year. So as this slide is going to be showing you, we know, for example, from a report back in 2020 that the total economic cost of sickness absence and productivity losses annually cost the UK £100 billion. A staggering amount. We also know from the Labour Force survey of 2021 that the average day off per worker due to sickness is 4.6. The previous year was 3.6. And we also know from the same report that the number of working days lost in millions due to sickness, and this is pre-pandemic, so 2019, was 138.2, and prior to that in 2020 was 118.2, and 2021 149.3. I just illustrated the pre-pandemic because for obvious reasons, really just what the usual sickness levels would look like. We then know from our SME survey report that we ran in December last year, when we asked business owners their key challenges. The biggest health and safety challenge for SME business owners for this year is mental health, and that's a staggering 85%. So sickness absence to do with mental health, or even with employees remaining at work with mental health, that's going to be the biggest health and safety challenge for this year. And we also know from the Health and Safety Executive, from their data they published back in November, that the work-related working days lost in millions because of stress, depression and anxiety was 17 million. And so really, if we think about that as a percentage, that's 65% of all work-related ill health cases that were due because of stress, depression, anxiety, which is staggering. So mental health is definitely on the increase. It's obviously we've known for some time that it's worsening, and obviously these statistics show that. So I thought that would be quite useful insight into just sort of the context around sickness absence. But also when it comes to managing sickness absence, employers must be mindful of the legal context for which we operate. So there are several pieces of employment legislation. We have the Employment Rights Act, and within the Employment Rights Act there is that implied duty of care within the contract of employment, and that duty of care on the employer means that they must take reasonable care to protect their employees from foreseeable harm. And we'll understand more about how that plays in with the return to work process as we come on to discuss that. We also have the Equality Act of 2010, so you'll know already that there are legal obligations placed on employers to make reasonable adjustments. That might be adjustments to the job role, to the working environment, the equipment that may be needed to carry out the role. This is essential because obviously somebody that has a disability in accordance with the Equality Act must have those reasonable adjustments made. And there is a specific definition of what constitutes a disability under this legislation. And then if we think about more of the health and safety legislation, then there are other key areas as well. So for example, the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974, it means that there are legal duties to protect the health, safety and welfare at work of all employees and workers as far as is reasonably practicable. And so far as is reasonably practicable, it doesn't mean that the employers can avoid their responsibilities, but it provides an employer the ability to argue that the cost of implementing a specific safety measure far outweighs the reduction of a risk to their employees. So it's like with reasonable adjustments, it's what's reasonable as well to the employer. So there is that legislation under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And then there are other health and safety laws. So we have laws that deal with the requirement to have risk assessments in order to reduce risk, use of display screen equipment, PPE to be provided where necessary. So there is many different pieces of legislation that impact employment, sickness absence, health and well-being that are all important and tie in very closely with return to work. So in terms of sickness absence, I think what's helpful is to be able to track and monitor your own absence in your own workplace, because sickness absence is a cost to the business. So I'm not sure if anybody on this webinar actually captures this or calculates it, but I just thought I'd run through what you would do. And it's essentially you're trying to find that proportion of how many working days were related to sickness absence. So you would add up the total number of days or hours that should have been worked in the year. You then work out the total number of days or hours that were lost due to sickness absence in that same period, and then divide the number of days, hours lost by the number of days, hours that should have been worked, and obviously multiply that by 100 to get a percent. So if we look at an example here, so generally a full-timer, there are 260 working days in a year. So if in this example we know the business employs 25 employees, so the first step is, well, how many available working days are there in a year? Well, if you've got 25 employees and you know generally there are 260 working days in a year, you simply multiply that. That gives you that 6,500. And then the second step is, well, actually, how many days have we lost due to sickness absence in the business? And so in this example, I've just made up a figure of 550. And then we simply get that, turn it into a percentage of an absence rate. So 550 divided by that 6,500 and multiply that 100. And what that gives you is an absence rate of 8.46%. So it's very helpful to be able to manage your absence levels and have that KPI, because you can have that as a target to work to reducing it. Now obviously what is a right percentage figure for your business will depend on many, many factors. The sector in which you're operating, for example, a warehouse environment is very different to an office-based environment. So as a business, you should perhaps try and find what is a measure that absence is relatively manageable for your business before it sort of tips over the edge and becomes unmanageable. And then it's trying to think about how your absence management procedure can help reduce and keep within that target. So before we get on to the next part of the webinar, I'm going to run a few polls. So Sue, if you could open the first one, and it's just really just to understand the kind of sickness environment culture that is currently in place. So do you have high absence levels in your business?
One's running now.
Okay. Let's see.
Okay, I'll
Thank you.
poll and share the results. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, quite close.
Quite, yeah, not quite 50-50, but yeah. And I think so 54% of you feel that you do have those high absence levels, and 3% are unsure. We don't record sickness absence. So perhaps, you know, thinking about those previous two slides, probably trying to find a way moving forward that allows you to track absence, set some target. It'll give you an idea as to the position that your business is in, whether you've got high absences or not. But yeah, okay, so that's fairly split. I'm just going to make a note of those.
Okay.
Thank you.
And
the next one, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's about whether you struggle to maintain productivity due to staff shortages that have been because of sickness absence.
Okay. I'll
Yeah.
close the poll and share those
So
results.
quite a lot, yeah. So 41% do struggle to maintain productivity, and it is really hard, isn't it, having to deal with staff absences. Yeah, 59% no.
So especially during holiday seasons and things like that.
Yeah,
when it
yeah,
really hits, isn't it? When you've got sickness absence on top of holidays, etc. So yeah. Okay, I'll hide that one and I will share the launch the next one.
Do you carry out return to work interviews?
I think this is the last one in this section, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'll close that one and share the results.
Okay. So 75% of you do carry them out and 25% of you don't. So hopefully, obviously, as we go through the next part of the webinar, the 25% of you will see actually how beneficial they can be to a business and tackling sickness absence levels. And obviously for those of you that do hold them, then there may be some new bits of information that I share that will be informative to you and perhaps get you thinking, or yeah. So thank you for that.
Okay, back to you.
So let's move on. And this is just really, before we go into understanding why they're important, it's just to sort of summarise what it actually is. And so return to work really is a key business tool, primarily for reducing sickness absence. Ultimately, that's your goal. And evidence does show that it's one of the best tools for managing sickness absence. And it's called a return to work interview, which kind of makes it feel like kind of a formal event. but actually it should be an informal discussion that takes place on employees' return to work, almost like a welfare discussion following their period of sickness. And then during that discussion, it's about trying to improve that person's sickness record moving forward, which is ultimately your overall game, and therefore contribute towards lowering absenteeism across the business. And it's used both in short-term absence cases, but also long-term sickness too. And so just for clarity, we generally categorise short-term as being sickness absence, perhaps less than 4 weeks, long-term typically anything longer than those 4 weeks. But obviously check your own company policies and practices as to how you define your short and long-term absence. But definitely it's a tool for both, regardless of the duration. And during the informal discussion, you chat about their overall sickness absence record. Generally, you look at using a 12-month rolling period, including obviously the recent absence they've just had off. But in some circumstances, discussing their general health may be necessary overall, because if they've got a long-standing medical condition and you're trying to work with them on supporting that whilst in the workplace, sometimes you just need to just talk more broadly. But generally that return to work discussion is about that last period of absence they've just had and they've come back into work from, but also just seeing that 12-month record and where what their absence levels are like overall in that 12-month rolling period. But let's look at why they are so important to the business. Well, first of all, management time and effort. A lot goes into managing sickness absence, and using a return to work interview is a tool to help you prevent that additional and excessive management time and effort that goes into it. So where absence is not effectively managed, it can lead to the high absence levels, and then therefore in turn leads to time and effort in dealing with formal absence meetings, appeal meetings, etc. High absence levels also lead to additional operational costs, whether it's because you need to bring in agency workers to help provide cover, whether you need to recruit fixed term employees to cover perhaps longer periods of ill health. And so it's really important as a tool to help prevent that. And of course it can lead to reduced productivity and put additional strain and pressures on the workload of the wider team if you're not having if you don't have an effective absence management procedure. There's also an overall operational disruption as a result of absence, and ultimately by carrying out return to work interviews, and you can prevent sickness absence moving forward. But actually, how do you prevent sickness absence through doing the return to work? And that's what we're going to go into detail now, and we're going to explore it because there's many aspects to it. And really a return to work is ultimately, as I said, about increasing attendance. You want to have the confidence as the employer that that employee's attendance is going to be improved. Because it also enables you to ensure as well that they're actually fit to return to work, as well as make the employee feel valued, which are really important. But there are many reasons as to why you should carry out a return to work interview. Well, first of all, it allows you to gain better insights about that time they've just had off. So what was the reason and what steps did they take to get better? It's really important that the employee takes responsibility for their own health and well-being. And so it's important to understand what are they doing to maintain that, maintain their good health. It's an opportunity for you to establish, are they fully recovered? Are you comfortable that they are right to be back at work? You can get really helpful insights in terms of whether their absence was part of an ongoing medical issue, and therefore could there be future absences connected with it, or do they need any support at work? Or if it was connected to a disability, do you need to revisit the reasonable adjustments that are already in place to ensure they remain fit for purpose and appropriate? Or if it's just come to light or they've only just been diagnosed, then it's around understanding their health to think about what adaptations do we now need to bring in. So it gives you that better insight into their absence and their general health, and these are all important questions that enable you to take corrective steps moving forward. But the return to work discussion also enables you to uncover issues and therefore identify solutions. So for instance, someone who's suffered ongoing migraines, perhaps they've now been referred to a specialist. You can then start to understand more about the impact at work, identify any measures they need that need to be taken to prevent future absence because of these migraines. So it might be some of the solutions that you think of is, you know, are they taking regular rest breaks from their PC? Are they changing the work that they're doing frequently enough to get that break from their monitor? Do they need to have a VDU eye test? Do you think there's going to be future time off needed, and therefore how is that time out for any appointments, etc., to be treated? And really importantly is, you know, what if the absence was because of a work-related issue and that caused the absence? It is vital that you then look to explore what that is and therefore take action to address it. Because you've got that duty of care, you've got to understand what the issue is and try and rectify it and deal with it. So it is really, really important as a forum in which you can uncover issues and then fulfill your responsibilities of identifying appropriate solutions. Return to work discussions are also really important because actually by holding them, it's allowing you to be able to comply with your legal obligations. So if we think back to those earlier slides where I set out the legal framework for managing sickness, you've got the Equality Act, you've got the Employment Rights Act, and you've got various pieces of health and safety legislation. Now, without conducting a return to work, you could end up falling foul of the law by failing to protect that health and well-being of your employees at work because you're not having that conversation. So you could potentially be putting yourself in a situation where you're missing out on identifying a need for a reasonable adjustment, taking action to address a workplace issue, etc. So they are really crucial for you ensuring that your business can remain compliant with its legal obligations. And, you know, how will you know what support or adjustments or measures are needed to be put in place to protect the health and safety and well-being of the employee if you're not having these return to work discussions? And there will be times as well when you also need to consider your risk assessment process as well, depending obviously the nature and the type of their health issue that led to the absence. So they are really important for legal compliance reasons. Return to work discussions are also a perfect way in which to monitor absence and to spot trends. So you can use your absence data that you've gathered from previous absence meetings in the past rolling 12 months to pick up any trends. So is there a pattern? Are they always having a Friday or a Monday off, i.e. they want that long weekend? Do they have sickness on or immediately after payday? Being able to have return to work discussions and keeping that track record of the occasions, the duration, and just looking at the days, the week that the absences are falling can help give you some really useful information, and enough just to have a conversation around, oh, actually, you know, we've noticed there's a pattern here because of X, Y, Z, and it's just simply just having that conversation can in itself help to act as a deterrent for future absences. And then, as I said, I suppose having these return to work discussions where you are monitoring the absence and spotting the trends, you're effectively letting the employee know that you do monitor absence in the business, and it does act as a good deterrent. Another key reason is to be able to identify reasonable adjustments, which I've also mentioned previously. You are legally obliged to have reasonable adjustments put in place for someone whose health condition constitutes a disability. Quite often it can be hard to know whether a health issue is a disability or not, and ultimately that will be down for a tribunal judge to rule when considering a case. But it's things like, you know, how long that person has had those health issues, how long are they likely to have those health issues, how does it affect their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, you know, and the impact of it. And clearly, you know, as line managers, you can only go so far for gauging an opinion, and then there comes a point where you need to reach out to external parties like a GP, medical specialist and occupational health, and get those medical reports. But the return to work discussion is a forum in which you can talk with your employee, understand about their health, the disability, and find some workable solutions by way of reasonable adjustments. Or if they've already got reasonable adjustments in place, then actually, like I've mentioned previously, you know, are they still fit for purpose? Do they need tweaking in any way? You know, because sometimes you might set out and have X, Y, Z put in place, the support condition, but actually just by trialing it and using it for a short period of time, you might need to take a different approach. So again, the return to work discussion is a good opportunity and forum in which you can have those conversations. And if we think about, obviously, the legal obligation for reasonable adjustments only applies when the medical condition meets that criteria or definition of a disability under the Equality Act. However, there will be some instances where being reasonable to still make some minor adaptations or small adjustments will be helpful, because ultimately you've got to think about, actually, if I let them just temporarily change their start time by an hour or 2 hours and shift their hours for a short period of time, because, for example, they might be taking medication, even if they're not covered by the Equality Act, the fact is that you could be encouraging good attendance at work. It's far better to have them in work than not at work. So the return to work discussion is a really useful forum for you to generally think about what support as an employer you can offer that employee to gain that good attendance, because ultimately your aim is to achieve good attendance and maintain it. And it's far better, as I said, to have somebody in work, if they're able to, of course, than not, and just making some small tweaks, for example, can help do that. And then having a return to work forum interview is also a good deterrent. The fact that businesses carry them out tells employees that the business monitors sickness absence, like I've said before, and can therefore act as that deterrent for those that may think to pull a sickie. You know, sometimes as well, people might genuinely feeling a bit, waking up thinking, oh my, you've got a bit of a headache, not 100%. They could still technically do the role, but sometimes there may be occasions where they think, I'll phone in sick. And it's trying to sort of, if you're having return to work interviews in place as part of your absence management procedure, it just might help prevent that. And actually they can still come in and it's fit enough to work, but there might not necessarily be that 100%, but not severe enough to require them to be off sick. And then in terms of the interview as well, because repeated short-term sickness absence can be incredibly disruptive, and most businesses will have some type of clear trigger system in place for managing unacceptable levels. This can be discussed in the meeting. So if you're using targets or a trigger system to help with improving attendance, so for example, you might have a threshold of only having so many days or occasions in a 12-month rolling period, or you might use the Bradford factor, for example. Well, once an employee has exceeded your own company trigger system targets, that is usually when the formal processes kicks in. So the return to work process allows you to communicate clearly to the employee where they are within your parameters for managing sickness. You know, are they very close to exceeding the targets, and therefore any further absences could trigger a formal meeting. And so it's a really, really important mechanism in which you clarify, reiterate expectations and set out targets for improved attendance moving forward. And finally, all of these combined, even though they're small individual steps, ultimately they'll all help in reducing future absence. whether that is thinking about adaptations that may be needed to help improve attendance, whether it's about that conversation that leads to then organising an occupational health referral to help improve attendance. You know, all of these things are so vitally important, and done effectively will help to reduce your sickness absence in your business. In research carried out by the CIPD, 78% of employers use return to works in managing short-term absence, and 83% of employers use return to works in managing long-term sickness absence. And they are generally one of the most important tools that are available for businesses. And I guess the key points and takeaways from this is, for me, is around, you know, keep consistent records. A template return to work form is useful for you to use across your whole business, and that will capture the start date of the absence, the end date, the reason, where the person is in the trigger system, etc. Any support that might be needed, any medication that there may be needed that you need to be aware of, etc. And of course, return to works is discussing sensitive personal data. So you've also got to be mindful of your GDPR obligations in regards to how you manage and handle health data. A really important piece of advice is around being consistent. You have to, if you're going to be carrying out return to works as part of your absence management procedure, you've got to be consistent. Not because otherwise you could be exposed to claims of unfair treatment. And I think, for me, an important message is around, you know, it's not an interrogation. Like I said at the outset, return to work interviews sound quite formal, but treat it as a welfare discussion. It's about just sense checking with them. Are you fit to be back? Are you ready? Are you okay? What can we do to help ease you back in? Do you need anything from me in the first few days? Etc, etc. So, and your starting position is always about, you know, the absence is genuine, and you're there to support and address it. And clearly you need to be managing their expectations with your trigger systems and things. But it should never be a distrusting conversation where you're expressing any doubt about the genuineness of absences. I mean, clearly there can be cases where absences aren't always genuine, and there will be factors that you pick up that perhaps lead you to thinking that, but that's a separate topic for another webinar, I would think. And then give the necessary time. Sometimes they only need to be 5 minutes. That's sufficient for the type of absence, the length of absence. Other times you may need to give longer because perhaps there's more complexity to it. To have the most impact, it's so vitally important that they take place on the employee's first day back into work. And I think if you think back to the slides where I talked about the legal obligations, if you're slow at carrying out the return to works and they're not happening timely, and perhaps, you know, I've known in the past where they've probably happened 2-3 weeks later from the absence, not only does that send a bad message to the employee that, you know, my employer doesn't really care about how my health is, it also shows perhaps that the company don't really monitor it, manage it. But vitally important is the piece around your legal obligations, because actually you could be seen to be too slow in dealing with a health condition and taking the necessary supportive steps to overcome some of the health challenges. You know, I have seen tribunal cases in the past where, you know, in disability claims and accusations of failing to make reasonable adjustments, part of the arguments talked about, you know, the delays in being asked if they're okay, do they need anything to support their disability. So it's really, really important that as part of your obligations to supporting the health and well-being of employees and any disabilities and their general health, that you act promptly, quickly, and as obviously as soon as they're getting back into the workplace, because if you need to make steps to manage their disability and reasonable adjustments, they should be done swiftly. And then just to summarise here, some of the key skills that are really important, clearly communication skills. It's about having that welfare discussion, but times where you need to be firm and fair. So really good at your communication skills, asking lots of open questions rather than closed questions. You are able as line managers to ask probing questions. Obviously it's a very sensitive subject, but as long as your questions are fair and reasonable, and the purpose of which are to help improve their attendance and getting them back into work and supporting them, then obviously you're able to do that. And it's about showing empathy and sensitivity to the situation. What's really important is the confidential nature of the discussions, because you're talking about somebody's health records, and being organised and prepared going into those meetings, because you can then pick up on any trends, patterns, so it's really important for managing the absence moving forward. So before we come on to the closing questions and a couple of other slides, just going to carry out, I think we've got 3 more polls. And I guess the first one is around who it is in your business that carries out the return to work interviews. Is it your line manager, or the immediate line manager to the employee, senior manager, or HR?
Okay, I'll close that and share the result.
Yeah, okay. So that's probably what we would have thought. And yeah, I mean, 77% of employees, immediate line manager, I think, they're best place, in my opinion, because it's the line manager that is managing that person day to day, knows them very well in terms of any previous health issues. Obviously from a work management point of view and what's gone on during their absence, they can brief them, so that it generally sits better with the employee's immediate line manager. Although the 18% of you that have HR do them, obviously there's nothing wrong in that, it can obviously 18% of you, I think as long as there's that feedback between the HR function and the employee's line manager to make sure the manager is up to speed on anything they need to be implementing.
Absolutely.
And then the senior manager. So I don't know if you've got any comments on the senior manager one. I think perhaps sometimes, I don't know.
Sometimes the experience, isn't it? That,
maybe, yeah.
And if they're newly appointed line manager, maybe they'll do them alongside. And sometimes it's the senior managers who've had the training in a larger organisation. Maybe that's, something they've decided, particular reasons they think it should be a senior manager.
Yeah, but it is interesting to see how all of you are running them, just to sort of for everybody to see and gauge that picture. So thank you.
Okay, and
then the next one is, it's a multiple choice. You can select more than one answer, and it's about, if you do carry out the return to works, which aspect of the process do you think is the most difficult? And I've put in other, and if you do have something else, then by all means just make a comment in our question pane and submit that. I think that should work.
That's working.
Yeah, oh good.
Thank you. Okay, I'll close that one and share those results.
Yeah, and finding the time to do them is a common challenge for many employers, especially if we're already trying to deal with staff shortages. I think, it's understandable if, when that happens. But like I said, sometimes it just might be a 5-minute conversation. And obviously other times it might need longer, but I think just be mindful and remember that you've got those legal obligations, and you don't want to put yourself in a position where actually the employees come back getting on with the work, and actually there is potential for their health to perhaps worsen or not be as protected as much because you've just missed that interview, that conversation with them. So even if it's that 2 minutes, how you doing, that initial welcome back, and just sense check you're happy that they're back, and say, look, can we pick up at the end of the day or what have you. I think it's just really important to try and find a way of fitting it in, because like I say, I've known tribunal cases where part of the arguments or included challenges around the timing of when they had their return to work interviews, and therefore missed opportunities to take reasonable adjustments and the right steps.
And one of the others was about getting managers to complete them.
Okay,
so
yes.
Similar kind of thing. Their reasons are probably because of the lack of time.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it is hard when you've got business pressures coming down, but they are so vitally important, and ultimately they will benefit the business because they will help drive down your sickness absence levels. Knowing the questions to ask, I can totally understand that, because it feels very strange to talk to somebody about very personal matters, and I think the thing to think of is that you need to understand how, if at all, it may impact on work, and so there is a need to know. So like I said, as long as the questions are reasonable and fair, and there's a genuine reason for asking them, i.e. you need that answer to know what to do in the workplace, you are able to ask questions, and really ask open questions, and then just take questions from what they're answering.
Yeah, and I think it could be role specific as well, because if you're in a highly risky environment, and that could be either due to vulnerability of the people that work in the department or the equipment that they're using. So actually checking on them to make sure they are fit, even if their fit note says they are fit to return, or they have determined themselves they're fit to return. It's that sense check yourself to make sure you are reassured they're not just coming back because they're going to get paid, that they are genuinely not going to pose you more of a risk. So, yeah.
And then 69% of you feel that it's a challenge knowing how much to explore of their health situation. And like I said a moment ago, it's it's for business reasons. You need to know what adjustments are appropriate for them, if there's any further absence that's likely to occur. And it is difficult because it is a very personal and can be a sensitive conversation to have, but it is necessary for ultimately managing absence and their health and well-being. And quite often you'll be sorry, Sue.
Oh, that's okay. It could also be why HR do it sometimes.
Yeah.
Because some managers just feel awkward handling those conversations, and I know in my experience I've often been asked to step in and do them because they know it's going to be sensitive, and they just want somebody else who's more experienced in dealing with those situations to handle it. But, I think it's very much as long as you've always got a genuine business reason for asking the question, then you can.
Yeah. And then 51% of you, which again I totally understand, knowing what adjustments should be, because what is reasonable? That's the tricky question, isn't it? And I think the starting point is getting that medical advice. So whether you write to an OcuHealth GP or their treating specialist, talking with the employee, what do they feel that they need that would help them in working more comfortably at work and remaining at work whilst managing a disability. and just taking it from there. There's also other things like access to work, which is through the government, the Job Centre Plus, where it is triggered by the employee rather than the employer. So the employee has to go to the access to work team, and once they do, then that will trigger off the team contacting the business, arranging a meeting, an appointment to come in, and they'll assess the employee at their workstation in the context of their disability, and then we'll produce a report for the employer that sets out what equipment might be needed to help them, and obviously there can be funding available as well, which will help businesses massively. So think about how you can use external sources of support, and ultimately your conversations with your employees about how they're feeling, how does their disability impact them, and therefore what measures may mitigate against the impact of it. And then we've got some other, 4% have said some other reasons. Is there anything in there that's
the only other one was that trade union reps can cause some challenges in the process, and I guess that depends on how cooperative the employee and the employer are being. It could be either or both sides. Yeah. So it's just an added complication in the process. Can be. Depends on the trade union, of course.
Okay.
But yeah, that's the only key other one I think that we haven't covered already.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, I totally get all of those. So I do feel the challenges. And then we've got one final one here.
Oh yeah, there we go.
If you don't currently conduct return to work interviews, do you think you're going to start introducing them into your workplace?
Okay.
Brilliant.
I'll close that and share that result.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, so yeah, that's really good news, because like I shared some of the statistics from the CIPD, and you know, a lot of employers, most employers will be holding them, carrying them out, and actually they're such a vital management tool. Yeah, so, and hopefully that can help lead to reducing sickness absence in your workplace. So we've got just a couple more slides, and then I think we've got Q&A after. So let's move on. And it's really just actually one final slide, and it's about further resources and information available for you. So it depends on whether if you subscribe to our HR knowledge base or not. So if you are a knowledge base user, then available to you will be a template return to work form. We have a return to work guidance document, a return to work checklist. And in terms of articles and information, there's lots of information out there. So we do have a specific news article all about return to work interviews, and then obviously all the other related articles, whether it's about the Equality Act, disability discrimination. We've got articles on managing both long-term and short-term absence. They're two separate ones. And occupational health, GP, medical evidence. So there's a lot of information there for you. So obviously do check the knowledge base. For those of you that don't have access to our knowledge base, then we have provided available to you a couple of things that may help you after today's webinar. Just simply scan this QR code and you can get available from our doc shop. You can download our return to work form, and we also have a general article around return to work interviews and why we do them. So please feel free to access those and download those from our document shop, and obviously also go back into our knowledge base for those of you that have access. So we're at the questions stage now. We're okay for time. So have we got many questions, Sue?
Yeah, we've got one or two.
Yeah.
So if I start with statistics first,
okay.
So there was a question around the 100 billion, I think it was, sickness absence statistics.
Oh, yeah.
This is are COVID absences included? I did have a double check on the source of the data, and they didn't specify that they'd excluded it. So I think they've just classed all sickness absence in
Right,
their research, but the government do make their data, the data sources and their processes completely transparent on their website, so you can actually search that and you can read a very detailed report on the data they've used and how they've interpreted it. So if you did want to explore that further, that is possible. And the next one was a question about, is there a benchmark to know what is considered a high average of sickness in a company? That's so company specific, sector specific.
It is.
You know, the government produce a national average, and you can determine whether your average is higher or lower than the national average and use that as your benchmark. But if you're in a trade association, they often produce them for the sector. Then there's also regional and other kind of averages that you can use, but it's actually up to the company to determine their own. They may have their own history of statistics to say that their average has gone up. Therefore, there's obviously, it's no longer kind of tolerable, because if it's causing productivity problems, so it can be really specific to the individual company, and it's up to them to set what they feel is reasonable for them based on what they do, what their productivity is, and how they can cope with absence. I guess the smaller the organisation, the more challenging it might be. So anything else you think of on that one?
No, that all sounds, yeah, I mean, it's difficult because there's no set target at all, is it? It's very sector specific and job environment, whether it's contact centre, warehouse, office, you know, it's very different.
Yeah. Home and workplace can have also impact on that. So the other questions around short-term and long-term absences, do we think the trigger points for absence stages should be treated separately or combined?
Normally, you would have your own trigger system for short-term absences and a quite different approach for long-term sickness. That's typically the case. So when you are setting your targets, and it is just purely looking at your short-term absence, because I think there is a different approach. I mean, when you're dealing with long-term ill health, it's more likely to be, you know, obviously really, really serious health issues. I'm not saying short-term aren't in any way, but you have to take a very different approach, and it's more about supporting them for that long period of absence and working with them to gradually get them back into work and sustain that return to work and build them back up. Short-term absence, there's less of that, and it's more about tackling the short-term intermittent off work, in work, off work, in work. And so there's only really your trigger systems for those kind of absences. Would you say, Sue? Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So another one is, what should managers do if staff refuse to disclose medical details? I guess this will depend on what contractual term you have as well, and or if you're using occupational health and they're refusing to have that. But you know, basically it depends on how you've worded your contract, but sometimes if staff won't disclose medical details, you'll have to make a decision based on the information you do have, and therefore you just have to kind of make sure you've got an audit trail that documents that you have asked them for the information, they've refused to give it you, you therefore base it on the information you have, and as long as the decision you make is reasonable based on the information you have, I guess that's the way forward. But if you encourage, sometimes if you just say to them, that's fine, but bearing in mind what we do now, X, that may mean we have to make a decision around that might not be what you want, whereas if we had more information, it might enable us to adjust that and be you know, be more suited approach to what you need. So it's just encourage them to help you help them in managing their the health issues,
Yeah.
whether that's either at work or enable them to return to work.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a bit of
I
a
agree. It can
yeah.
be hard, but yeah.
Yeah. So another one is, should the return to work interview be completed with a witness? Not necessarily. No right to
No.
be accompanied, and usually it's a line manager employee situation,
Yeah.
to maintain the confidentiality. It's only really if you're going down the dismissal route on the reasons of absence, or
Mm.
that you really need.
Yeah. And I suppose if you think about it, it is a welfare discussion, informal, and you want to try and get the most out of it. And I think if you have other parties in there, it just starts becoming more formal and more heavy-handed, and you just want that comfortable, easy conversation where you're getting as much out of the employee as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another one. If somebody returns to work, just going back to our ensuring you have these conversations. So if they return to work and they're not fit, as they are worried about the financial consequences,
Yeah.
how should managers deal with this in terms of paying them or sending them home?
Oh, it's really difficult,
That's a
isn't it?
tricky one, isn't it? Because you
Really,
don't
and it,
want to go down medical suspension
no.
route
I mean,
unless you have to.
I've been in these situations, and I think this is why communication skills are so important, about how it comes down to how you're handling and managing that conversation, isn't it? Because what you want to do is, through your return to work discussion, get them to seeing actually they're not well enough to be back at all, they've come back too early, and it's how you handle those conversations to get them to get to that viewpoint themselves. Because the last thing, you don't want to have to be getting all formal and sending them back home again because you get into the murky waters of suspension or not. You want to have that conversation where you're subtly sort of getting them to realise, actually, no, I'm not fit to be back. But it's hard.
And I think it's different if they've got a fit note that says they're fit to return. Then it is the fit note. Remember, is an indicator to the employee as to whether or not they should attend work, and it's then evidence they can give the employer if they decide not to attend work. Otherwise, they'd be breaching the contract. So if their fit note is saying they're fit to return, then you need to really get another medical opinion if you dispute what it's saying, potentially like an occupational health assessment as opposed to the GP fit note. But if it's self-certified absence and you know they're not really well enough, then it's just encouraging them to take some more time.
Yeah.
And whether you pay them or not will depend on your policy, your contractual terms, and you obviously don't want to set a precedent, so you need to consider whether that's SSP or whatever.
It's really hard, isn't it? A tough one, that.
It is. So are the interviews themselves a legal requirement, or do they just aid legal obligations?
No, they're not a legal obligation. They're not a legal requirement, sorry. It's more of a best practice recommendation that they form part of your absence management procedure. But just remember that, sorry, Sue.
Carry on. I was just going to say it's more a health and
safety. It is health and well-being, and it's, I guess, by doing them, you are able to comply with your legal obligations because you're not missing opportunities to take action. Yeah. But it's best practice that you do them.
And it could minimise any risk of some of the legal obligations kicking in, really.
Yeah.
Is one return to work interview enough, or should we be doing more? It's interesting. I guess if it's a return to work and staged, then you definitely would need regular contacts. But if it's a one-off, I think you should really check in. But it might be even more important that you just say, is it still going okay? And
I mean, if somebody's just been off with cold and flu, then you perhaps don't necessarily need to. If somebody's been off with a recurring health issue, check in. If somebody's come back after a period of long-term sick, then yes, as part of their phased plan, build in review checkpoints So you are touching base with them to see how they're progressing on their building back up. So it will very much depend, but standard sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 like days of short-term sickness, like colds, flus, headaches. I think generally just the one is enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not a blanket approach, I guess.
No. So I don't know. Are we okay for time? Are we? Do we want
think
to do?
so. Yeah.
One more. So
Yeah.
if an employee suffers from depression and stress, how can we support and do reasonable adjustment if we work for a retail sector where most of the time will be a busy environment?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Hard
So
one, isn't it, as well?
it is hard, and it's quite a broad question. I suppose if the stress, I mean,
It depends what causes it, isn't it? It depends if it's sometimes it can be sometimes it can help people. They like the fact it's really busy, and it can be a distraction if the cause of it is not because it's customer facing and things like that. Some people are quite withdrawn and therefore struggle in a customer facing role. So it'll all be down to whether you have any opportunities for them to adjust their role, whether it be temporary or longer term, to enable them to continue working, but maybe not in the customer facing initially while they build up their confidence again. But that's going to be really specific to the organisation, because you don't have to create roles, but if you have opportunities that enable them to maybe on a phased return basis or a trial basis work in a slightly different role to get them back in the working environment prior to maybe carrying on, but that would need potentially occupational health support and knowing maybe counselling and guidance from the employee as to what they feel they could and can't do and what would be a trigger for them to make it worse.
It's really hard because ultimately, I mean, the obligation is reasonable adjustments. It's not every adjustment. So actually, if your retail and the environment is just typically so busy constantly, then you can't do anything about that. That's the job. That's the nature of the job. And so the conversations need to be around, longer term. If you've exhausted other things, well, really, that is the nature of the role. It is a busy environment. But obviously you've got to look at all adjustments like you've just gone through, and it could also include, how about doing fewer hours? Would it work? Can you accommodate? Can the person deal with it if they were to work fewer hours?
Or at quieter periods of time. Not so full on. If that's ever predictable, depends on the retail environment, I guess. But yeah, it's whatever you can do that's reasonable and that is within your power to do without creating more challenges for yourself. So there's a question around absence level triggers. If we don't have a trigger point, at which point can we commence formal capability process? Or can we go ahead with it if an individual refuses to see occupational health? So I guess there's two questions there. One we partially covered was if they refuse to see occupational health, as long as you've explained to them the benefits of having that information, if they continue to refuse, then you have to base any decisions on what you know, the facts you know. But if you don't have a trigger, you don't necessarily, a lot of people don't have triggers. They just manage each case individually, depending on what it is. And I think as long as you're consistent in how you apply that, a lot of people don't want to have a trigger because 5 absences in relating to a cold they just couldn't shift, especially with the current viruses going around, might be different to somebody who has 5 absences where it's a different thing every time, and actually it potentially isn't genuine or serious if it's just the odd day or the odd. So I guess you need to have a policy at least that says you will manage and that you do return to work interviews to consider each period of sickness and what it is, and then look for trends and patterns, and that you consistently apply it. Would you say?
Yeah, it is about being consistent, isn't it? Like you say, for those that don't have those structures, at least try and be consistent in your approach. But yeah,
I mean, there's a lot that don't. There's a lot that don't have a trigger mechanism, because the disadvantage of a trigger mechanism is that it's a kind of one size fits all, and you do have to be careful how you apply it, and that you don't inadvertently kind of discriminate by using it, because you'd have to exclude disability-related absences from that kind of a process. And so it is something to sort of consider carefully, and it can work both ways, but you can still manage it, and you absolutely should manage it as long as you're consistent. And somebody's asked, what is the Bradford factor that we mentioned? It's just a formula, again, using a kind of trigger, a Bradford factor score, and you'll say that if your score is above a certain amount, and that again it's based on triggers. It's the number of absences by number of individual absences by the number of days absence.
It's a set formula,
it's a set formula that enables you to apply, and some software systems will give you a Bradford factor score automatically calculated. But again, it's very rigid and a little bit like triggers. You have to be careful how you apply it. And it was a very common one in manufacturing companies, introduced by trade unions, I think, to try and introduce some kind of consistency when there's large workforces. But there's a lot of companies not using it anymore. I know in our own client base, there's very few that use it. There are some that do, but a lot of people are looking at a more, I don't know whether flexible is the right word, but a more
something that could be adjusted, I suppose, for disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, it's treating sickness statistically can be a challenge. Because there's obviously a human behind the sickness, and so you need to kind of consider that what is causing it, why they absent, is there anything that can be done to minimize it from the individual or from the employer's aspect, and things like that. So it's good to have these conversations and not have individuals thinking, oh my goodness, if I'm off once more, I'm going to end up with a formal meeting, and therefore they might turn up to work when they're not really fit to, and that can cause you all sorts of other problems. So and somebody just commented it doesn't take into account critical illnesses such as cancer. So which is what we're trying to say. It's not, doesn't take account of all the factors, and a bit like triggers, you need to be really careful how you apply them. When you use a formula to create, you know, process stages of the process.
I have known previously employees use trigger systems, but then where there's an absence case involving a disability, through discussion in occupational health, they've adjusted the trigger system for that individual based on the health prognosis and nature of that health condition. So they've applied an appropriate trigger system for that individual. So and that was seen as a reasonable adjustment, so that they weren't fast tracking through the normal triggers, because of the nature of the absence would mean that they'll be going from first warning to dismissal in a short period of time, just by the nature of their health issues. So I have known employers adjust trigger systems and seen that as a reasonable adjustment.
So, and then it asks, if you're having to do that anyway, is there a better process or a better way of managing? I mean, it's so down to the organisation, the size of the organisation, the size of the sickness challenge. And I appreciate that in larger setups, you sometimes do need something that at least that you may not make visible to employees, but maybe just trigger to managers. Look, there is a lot of absence. Can download a report and have a look, just make sure that there's nothing going on that we need to address. Sometimes it's used kind of as a management tool to just trigger an investigation, not necessarily to trigger some action. So and it as I say, it is all down to how you use it and how you apply it.
And somebody's commented that many companies are moving away from the Bradford factor, and it is quite 80s, isn't it? as a system.
It was, as I think it was a union kind of driven intervention, I think, time. My memory serves me correctly. Old enough to remember working in the 80s. just about. So I think that's all our questions for now. So thank you. Thanks, Victoria.
Thank you. So let's move through to the closing slides, and really it's just to let you know about some of our services and training, etc., and how you can get in touch with us. So this slide here is just showing you all of our training courses that we can offer, managing grievance, disciplinaries, performance, and I'm sure there'll be absence as well. There's lots of different training courses that we offer there. So do scan the QR code if you are interested in any training that we can help you with. And of course, we also run health and safety courses. We have an emergency first aid coming up 24th of April. And obviously we offer a lot, including mental health first aid. So if you're thinking about introducing mental health ambassadors or mental health first aiders, get in touch with us and we can sort of talk to you through about how, what that qualification provides and how that would work. So many of you on this webinar today will be regulars to our webinars. For those of you that are new, then it's just to let you know that we run these every month. This is the schedule to take us up through to October, so we've got some really interesting ones coming up. You will have probably heard about the EU law reform bill, which is where at the end of this year the potential a lot of EU-based legislation will be abolished unless Parliament says otherwise. So we're going to run a webinar next month on that. And you'll also know recently the 4-day working week trial closed. So we're going to be talking about 4-day working weeks and look at the pros and cons of adopting it. We're hearing queries coming through on 4-day working weeks, so I think it's going to be a really relevant topic. So that will be in June, and then with July we're going to be talking about recruitment. So obviously we continue to see struggles with recruitment, getting candidates, and so it's just thinking about why businesses and how businesses can take a different approach to recruitment. And then moving on to August, we're looking at then building skills and capabilities of your workforce. And I suppose that links in closely as well with how that can combat some of your recruitment challenges as well, because ultimately you can recruit from within. And September is about how you can become an age-friendly employer, looking at both ends of the spectrum in terms of supporting young workers into work, retaining older employees rather than seeing them leave for retirement. And then we have some potential changes coming up later in this year around travel to the Sheringham area. So we're going to give you an update on immigration in October to help you with that, which is obviously important if you carry out a lot of business travel into that area. So before we close, we just want to run one final poll, and it's really about how we can help you on from any of our services, whether it's health and safety, our HR services, the HR knowledge base that I talked about, payroll, training. So do let us know and we can get in touch with you and follow up with you about those services. Okay.
Okay, I'll close that one off.
Yep. And then that's the final slide, and just to thank you all for joining our webinar again this month. It's great to have you join us. A copy of the slides will be going out afterwards, and thank you to Sue and Drew for supporting the webinar as well. So look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you. Bye-bye.